The crystal chandelier above table 12 vibrated with the force of a grief that no amount of money could silence. Mrs. Kang's screams were not merely loud. They were jagged, tearing through the curated silence of the sapphire-tinted dining room like a blade through silk. Around her, the elite of the city froze, their silver forks suspended midair, their faces masks of polite horror. At the center of the storm sat Ji-hoon, his silhouette a sharp, dark edge against the soft glow of the candlelight. He was 31, a man whose name was whispered in the docks and the boardrooms alike, a man who commanded legions but could not command the broken mind of his own mother. Mrs. Kang's hands, adorned with diamonds that could buy a city block, hammered against the white linen cloth, sending crystal flutes of vintage champagne shattering onto the floor. She was wailing in a dialect that sounded like a funeral dirge, her eyes wide, and seeing ghosts that no one else could perceive. Ji-hoon's jaw was set, so tight the bones seemed ready to snap. His hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his posture radiating a lethal tension that kept even his own security detail at a suffocating distance. The head waiter hovered 10 feet away, trembling, his face drained of color, knowing that to intervene was a death sentence and to do nothing was a failure. The air in the restaurant had turned frigid, heavy with the scent of spilled alcohol and the metallic tang of fear. Mrs. Kang suddenly grabbed a porcelain plate, her face contorting into a mask of pure agony, and heaved it toward the wall. It shattered into 1,000 jagged stars. Ji-hoon didn't flinch, but his eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of profound, helpless exhaustion crossing his handsome, stony features. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, yet he was drowning in the middle of a fine dining room, anchored by a woman who had forgotten his name but remembered every ounce of her sorrow. The restaurant staff retreated into the shadows, leaving the pair in a circle of isolation until a soft rustle of fabric broke the rhythm of the tantrum. Naomi stepped out from behind the velvet curtain of the kitchen entrance, her white dress glowing like a beacon in the dim light, her long red apron a splash of vibrant, defiant color against the monochromatic tension of the room. Naomi moved with a stillness that was jarring amidst the chaos, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet as she bypassed the frantic gestures of her manager. She didn't look at the guards, whose hands were already drifting toward the concealed holsters beneath their tailored jackets. She didn't look at the patrons watching with bated breath. Her focus was entirely on the woman whose soul seemed to be leaking out through her screams. As Naomi approached, a guard stepped into her path, his chest a wall of dark wool. Naomi didn't stop. She simply looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a quiet, immovable gravity that made the man hesitate. It wasn't a look of challenge, but one of absolute certainty. Ji-hoon's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. Who was this girl? Barely 21, with skin the color of rich earth and a dress that looked like a shroud of peace, walking into the center of a hurricane. He felt a surge of protective instinct mixed with a dark, simmering irritation. He didn't want to witness to his mother's degradation, yet he couldn't look away from the way the light caught the red of Naomi's apron. It reminded him of something from a dream he couldn't quite place, a memory of warmth before the world turned cold. Naomi reached the table and did something that made the entire room gasp in collective shock. She didn't offer a towel, she didn't apologize for the mess, and she didn't try to usher them to a private room. Instead, she slowly sank to her knees on the floor, right in the middle of the broken glass and the spilled wine. She placed herself lower than Mrs. Kang, her posture one of profound humility and strength. The guards shifted, looking to Ji-hoon for the signal to drag her away, but Ji-hoon remained motionless, his breath hitching in his chest. He saw Naomi's hands. They were steady, unlike his own. She reached out, not to grab Mrs. Kang's flailing arms, but to simply rest her hand on the edge of the chair, a few inches away from the older woman's frantic grip. The silence she brought with her was heavy, a physical weight that began to press against the jagged edges of Mrs. Kang's hysteria. Naomi's presence was a question asked in a language of silence, and for the first time in 20 minutes, Mrs. Kang's wailing faltered into a ragged, questioning sob. The air seemed to thicken as Naomi began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in the floorboards. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lullabies, a melody forged in the fires of a past Naomi never spoke of. She reached for a clean linen napkin that had fallen to the floor, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were performing a sacred ritual. With practiced grace, she began to fold the fabric, her fingers dancing with a precision that demanded attention. Mrs. Kang's eyes, red-rimmed and clouded with confusion, drifted down to Naomi's hands. The older woman's chest was still heaving, her breath coming in sharp, hitching gasps, but the physical violence of her grief had begun to ebb. Naomi didn't look up, focusing entirely on the napkin. She folded it once, twice, then tucked the corners with a deft flick of her wrist. Within seconds, a small, perfect white bird sat in her palm. She didn't hand it to Mrs. Kong. She simply placed it on the table, right in the center of a puddle of spilled Bordeaux. The white fabric began to soak up the red wine, the color creeping up the bird's wings like a slow, blooming rose. Mrs. Kong reached out a trembling finger, touching the damp fabric. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but a whimper of recognition. Naomi finally looked up, her gaze meeting the mother's. There was no pity in Naomi's eyes, only a deep, resonant understanding of what it meant to be lost in one's own mind. Ji-hoon watched the scene, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that felt like a physical assault. He had spent millions on the best doctors, the most expensive sedatives, and the most secluded villas, but he had never seen anyone reach the woman behind the madness. He looked at Naomi, really looked at her, and saw the faint, silver scar that ran along the side of her neck, a mark of her own survival. She was a wounded healer, a girl who had walked through her own fire and come out with the ability to recognize the smoke in others. The tension in the room shifted from a threat of violence to a strange, breathless intimacy, as if the restaurant had vanished and left only 3 souls in a void of red wine and white linen. Ji-hoon leaned forward, the shadows of his face softening under the amber light. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice a low rasp that carried more vulnerability than he had ever allowed himself to show in public. Naomi didn't flinch at the sound of the most dangerous man in the city speaking to her. She didn't even turn her head. "She's not here," Naomi said, her voice a melodic contrast to his harsh tone. "She is back in the garden where the red lilies grow. She is looking for someone who isn't coming back." The words hit Ji-hoon like a physical blow to the solar plexus. His mother had lost his younger sister 20 years ago in a garden filled with red lilies, a tragedy that had fractured her mind and turned his heart into a fortress of ice. No one in this city knew that story. It was buried under layers of redacted police reports and paid-off witnesses. He felt a sudden, sharp surge of suspicion, his protective instincts flaring back to life. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward the inside of his jacket. Naomi finally turned her gaze to him, and the intensity in her eyes made him freeze. "Because I have spent my life in that same garden," she replied softly. "I know the smell of the earth when it takes what you love." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Kong had stopped crying entirely. She was now holding the wine-stained cloth bird against her cheek, her eyes closed, a look of fragile peace settling over her wrinkled features. The guards were motionless, their eyes wide, sensing the shift in power. Ji-hoon felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. He had spent his life building walls, ensuring that no one could ever get close enough to see the cracks in his soul, and yet this waitress, this girl in a stained red apron, had just walked through his front door and set a fire in the hearth. He looked at his mother, who was now leaning her head toward Naomi, drawn to the warmth the younger woman radiated. It was a sight he had thought impossible, a miracle occurring in the middle of a scene of destruction. The manager finally found his courage and scurried forward, his face a mask of feigned authority. "I am so sorry, Mr. Kong. This girl. She's new. She doesn't know the protocol. Naomi, get up this instant and go to the back. You're fired." The manager reached out to grab Naomi's shoulder, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. Before he could make contact, Ji-hoon's hand shot out, catching the manager's wrist in a grip that made the man's knees buckle. "Touch her," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a register that promised a very specific kind of pain. "And you will never use that hand again." The manager turned a sickly shade of gray and stepped back, his mouth hanging open. Ji-hoon didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi, who hadn't moved a muscle when she was threatened with the loss of her livelihood. She simply continued to sit on the floor, her presence a grounding force for the woman beside her. Mrs. Kong reached out and took Naomi's hand, her fingers interlacing with Naomi's. The contrast was striking, the aged, pale hand of the Korean matriarch against the youthful, dark skin of the waitress. It was a bridge built across a chasm of culture, age, and trauma. "She stays," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice echoing through the silent restaurant. He looked around at the gawking patrons, his gaze like a physical weight that forced them to look away. Everyone out. Now the restaurant emptied in a blur of motion, the elite of the city scurrying for the exits as the guards moved to facilitate their departure. Soon, the only people left in the cavernous, luxury space were the boss, his mother, and the waitress. The silence that remained was no longer heavy with threat, but with the possibility of something new. Ji-hoon stood up, his movements fluid and predatory, yet there was a new hesitation in his step as he walked around the table to where Naomi knelt. He looked down at her, the intensity of his gaze enough to wither a lesser person. "What is your name?" he asked, the question sounding more like a plea. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Naomi," she said simply. He repeated it under his breath, the name a strange new rhythm in his heart. "Naomi," he said again, louder this time. "You have done something today that no one else could." "Why?" Naomi stood up slowly, helping Mrs. Kong to her feet with a gentleness that made Ji-hoon's chest ache. "Because everyone deserves to be found when they are lost," she said, her voice steady. "Even people who live in palaces." The rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant, turning the world outside into a blurred smear of neon and gray. Inside, the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. Ji-hoon stood motionless, his eyes tracing the line of Naomi's jaw, the steady rise and fall of her shoulders. He was a man who dealt in certainties, contracts, debts, and the cold logic of power. But this girl was an anomaly he couldn't calculate. He watched as she gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind his mother's ear, a gesture so intimate and filled with unearned grace that it made his throat tighten. Mrs. Kong was leaning into Naomi's touch, her eyes half closed, the storm in her mind temporarily calmed by the presence of a stranger. Ji-hoon felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like hope. He signaled to his lead guard, a man whose face was a map of old scars, to bring the car around to the front entrance. "You cannot go back to the kitchen," Ji-hoon said, his voice low and commanding, yet lacking its usual serrated edge. Naomi looked at him, her expression calm, though her heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her red apron, stained with the wine of a woman's sorrow, and then back at the man who held the city in his palm. "I have a shift to finish," she replied, her voice a soft defiance. Ji-hoon stepped closer, his scent, expensive tobacco and something cold like winter air, enveloping her. "The shift ended the moment you knelt on that floor," he countered. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy, gold-embossed card, but he didn't hand it to her. He held it between them, a bridge she hadn't asked for. "My mother hasn't been this quiet in 3 years. She won't let go of your hand, and I won't let go of her. If you walk away now, the dark will take her again. Is that what you want?" Naomi looked at Mrs. Kong, whose fingers were still threaded through hers like a drowning person clutching a lifeline. She thought of her own mother, who had faded into the shadows of a state hospital years ago because no one had been there to hold her hand when the ghosts came. The memory was a sharp, cold needle in her chest. She knew the cost of walking away. She knew the weight of the silence that followed a scream. "I need to change my clothes," Naomi said quietly, her surrender a whisper that filled the room. The drive to the Kong estate was a journey through a city Naomi only knew from the windows of buses and the edges of shadows. She sat in the back of the black sedan, sandwiched between the silent, grieving matriarch and the lethal, brooding son. The leather seats were cold, the air inside the car smelling of rain and the heavy, floral perfume Mrs. Kong wore. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers, a metronome for the tension that filled the small space. Ji-hoon stared out the window, his profile a jagged silhouette against the passing streetlights. He was acutely aware of the girl beside him. He could hear the soft rustle of her dress, the way her breathing slowed as she focused on keeping Mrs. Kong calm. He felt a strange, jarring urge to reach out and touch the scar on her neck, to ask her who had hurt her and where she had learned to speak to the broken. But he remained frozen in his own armor, a king who didn't know how to be a man. When the car finally pulled through the massive iron gates of the estate, the grandeur of the place felt like a threat. The mansion rose out of the darkness like a fortress, all sharp angles and cold stone. As they stepped out into the biting night air, a man stepped from the shadows of the portico. He was older, dressed in a gray suit that seemed to blend into the mist, his eyes sharp and devoid of warmth. This was Mr. Park, Ji-hoon's longest-serving advisor, and the man who kept the gears of the Kong Empire turning with blood and silence. Mr. Park's gaze raked over Naomi, his lip curling in a subtle, deceptive sneer. "Who is this, Ji-hoon? We have protocols for the staff, and this person does not fit them." Ji-hoon didn't even look at him as he led his mother toward the door, Naomi still firmly attached to her side. "She isn't staff, Park. She's the only reason my mother isn't currently tearing the Golden Dragon apart. Treat her as you would treat me, or you'll find out how quickly protocols can be rewritten." The threat was delivered with a casualness that was more terrifying than a shout, and Naomi felt the weight of the danger she had just walked into. This wasn't a house, it was a battlefield, and she was the only one without a weapon. Inside the mansion, the opulence was suffocating. Every surface was marble or gold, yet the air felt thin, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Naomi spent the first few hours in Mrs. Kang's private wing, a suite of rooms that looked more like a museum than a home. She sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than her apartment building, gently unlacing Mrs. Kang's shoes while the older woman watched her with a wide-eyed, childlike curiosity. The tantrum had left Mrs. Kong exhausted, her movements slow and heavy. Naomi didn't speak. She simply moved with a quiet, grounding rhythm, creating a sanctuary of normalcy in a place built on excess. Late in the night, after Mrs. Kong had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Naomi stepped out onto the balcony. The city glowed in the distance, a sea of flickering lights that felt a million miles away. She felt a presence behind her before she heard him. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He looked less like a boss and more like a man who was unraveling. "She's sleeping," Naomi said, her voice barely a whisper. Ji-hoon walked to the railing, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold metal. "She hasn't slept through the night since the accident," he said, his voice cracking for a fleeting second. He turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the intensity in his eyes. "Why did you stay? You saw the guards. You know who I am." "Most people run when they see the shadow I cast." Naomi turned to face him, her back to the city. "I've lived in shadows my whole life, Mr. Kong. Yours isn't the first, and it isn't the darkest." She reached up and touched the silver scar on her neck, a gesture of raw vulnerability that made Ji-hoon flinch. "I stay because she asked me to, without saying a word. And because I think you're just as lost as she is. You've just gotten better at pretending you know the way home." Ji-hoon stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, his fingers trembling with a conflict he couldn't name. For a moment, the world was just the two of them, the wounded healer and the man who broke things, standing on the edge of a precipice. The silence was shattered by the sudden, sharp crack of a gunshot echoing from the lower floors. The sound was followed by the frantic shouting of guards and the heavy thud of boots on the marble stairs. The deceptive threat had finally breached the walls. Ji-hoon's transformation was instantaneous. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He shoved Naomi back toward the bedroom, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked into the small of his back. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I come for you," he hissed, his voice a whip-crack of command. But Naomi didn't run. She saw the door to Mrs. Kang's room burst open from the inside as the older woman, woken by the noise, stumbled out in a state of renewed terror. Mrs. Kang began to scream again, a high, thin sound that would lead the attackers straight to them. Below, the sound of breaking glass and more gunfire told the story of a coordinated hit. Ji-hoon cursed, his eyes darting between his mother and the hallway. He was a target, and his presence here was a death sentence for the woman he loved. "Park!" he roared, but there was no answer. Only the sound of a struggle in the corridor. A man in a dark tactical vest rounded the corner, his weapon raised. Before Ji-hoon could fire, Naomi did the unthinkable. She stepped in front of Mrs. Kang, shielding the older woman's body with her own, and began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby this time, but a powerful, resonant spiritual, her voice cutting through the chaos like a clarion call. The attacker hesitated, the sheer unexpectedness of the sound throwing him off his rhythm. That split second was all Ji-hoon needed. He fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the hallway in a brief, violent burst of light. The attacker fell, but more were coming. Ji-hoon grabbed Naomi by the arm, his grip bruising. "We have to move. Now." They fled through the darkened halls, Naomi literally carrying the weight of Mrs. Kang, who had collapsed into a catatonic state. They reached a hidden service elevator just as a grenade detonated in the main foyer, the shockwave rattling the very foundations of the house. In the cramped, vibrating space of the elevator, Ji-hoon looked at Naomi. Her white dress was splattered with soot and a spray of blood that wasn't hers. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear, her arms still wrapped tightly around his mother. He realized then that he hadn't saved her from the restaurant. She had been the one saving them all along. The safe house was a modest cabin tucked deep into the woods, miles away from the blood-soaked marble of the estate. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the pines, casting long, golden fingers across the wooden floor. Mrs. Kang was asleep on a small cot, her hand still clutching a piece of Naomi's red apron that had been torn in the escape. Ji-hoon sat on the porch, his head in his hands, the weight of his empire suddenly feeling like a shroud he was ready to cast off. He heard the screen door creak open and felt Naomi sit down beside him. She didn't say anything. She simply sat in the quiet, watching the light change. The deceptive threat, a rival syndicate aided by the treacherous Mr. Park, had been neutralized, but the victory felt hollow. Ji-hoon looked at his hands, the hands that had built a kingdom of fear, and then at Naomi's hands, which had built a sanctuary of peace. "I lost everything tonight," he said, his voice a low, broken rasp. Naomi shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "No. You lost a house. You kept your mother. And you found a way to breathe again." She reached out and placed her hand over his, a simple, protective gesture that carried more power than any army he had ever commanded. Ji-hoon turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. The ice that had encased his heart for a decade finally began to crack, the warmth of her touch seeping into the marrow of his bones. They were an unlikely alliance, a mafia boss and a waitress, a man of violence and a woman of healing, but in the ruins of the night, they had found a family. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with the ghosts of their pasts and the dangers of his world, but for the first time, Ji-hoon wasn't afraid of the dark. He looked at Naomi, and in her eyes, he saw a future that didn't require a throne. He saw a garden where the lilies could finally grow without being trampled. He saw redemption. And as the sun rose higher, he knew that the miracle he had witnessed in the restaurant was only the beginning of a much longer story of healing. To those of you watching, have you ever found light in the darkest of places? Have you ever had a stranger change the entire course of your life with just a single gesture of kindness? Sometimes the people we think need saving are the ones who end up saving us. Tell us your story in the comments below, and don't forget to hold on to the people who find you when you're lost.